Good morning, afternoon, evening, and welcome to Concerned Citizens Presents, a new offering on Village TV. Concerned Citizens of Laguna Woods is an organization committed to peace, social justice, economic equality, and a clean environment. For the duration of the lockdown, instead of its usual 2 meetings a month, Concerned Citizens will broadcast 2 programs a month on this channel. Our programs will feature films, lectures, and debates on topics related to our mission. We hope you enjoy today's program.
Welcome to Concerned Citizens Presents. My name is Barbara Seary and I co-chair the committee responsible for these broadcasts. At long last, Concerned Citizens has begun holding meetings in person. Consequently, Concerned Citizens Presents now has 2 sources for its programming: remote presentations like this one and rebroadcasts of speakers presenting live to our membership. Wonderful as it is to have a live expert in our midst, Concerned Citizens is pleased also to be able to bring you insights from experts around the globe. Today, we bring you Professor Andrew Jenks, a specialist in modern Russian history at Cal State Long Beach. And then that's pretty much around the globe, don't you think? Professor Jenks earned his PhD from Stanford and has published books and articles on Russian culture, Soviet spaceflight, and technological disasters. He's now writing a book on Russian immigrants to Mexico, Los Rusos, Revolutions, Statelessness, and the Russian Diaspora in Mexico from 1905 to 1965, currently under contract with Cornell University Press. So that's going to be about Trotsky too, I guess, in Mexico. We're so glad to have you, Professor Jenks, especially in the light of the crisis in Ukraine, and hope you can help us shed light on Ukrainian and Russian history and how it underlines the present situation. And online with us, we have 6, including myself, of our fellow Concerned Citizens members. And after Professor Jenks's presentation, we'll all get a chance to ask questions. So welcome, and let's begin, Professor Jenks.
Well, thank you for that great introduction, and also for having me. I really am grateful to be here and to talk about this very difficult situation. And the military thinker Otto von Clausewitz famously talked about the fog of war, and what he meant by that was that these kinds of military situations are hard to interpret when we're in the midst of them. And the lesson of history, as I tell my students, is that we need quite a bit of historical distance from the events to be able to really figure them out. So that's a caveat with regard to what's happening today in Ukraine. I think that, I'm an historian, not a future caster. And the one thing that I learned from history is that it never turns out the way the historical actors think it will. And I'll just give you a couple of examples of that. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, which in many respects set the stage for the situation that we're experiencing now, no one predicted it, not even, the CIA, which is supposed to be in the business of forecasting things. So it took everyone completely by surprise, as did the collapse of the Berlin Wall in November of 1989. So no one predicted that. Everyone thought the Soviet Union was going to be around and muddle through one way or another for the foreseeable future. And I think the similar thing can be said 2 months ago, before the invasion of Ukraine, that no one could have anticipated that the world that invasion produced and the invasion itself would have happened. It was totally unpredictable. And I would say the same thing will happen going into the future. Whatever the outcome of this situation will be, one thing I think we know for sure, and that is that no one will predict it correctly. So be prepared for some surprises. And usually the way things end up in history, I hate to say this, but is usually much worse than people anticipate, particularly when it concerns the outcomes of war. And of course, we all have deep knowledge of this with regard to the depressing example of the Holocaust. And hopefully, and also what happened in Yugoslavia when it collapsed in the 1990s and produced episodes of genocide that are hauntingly similar to the situation that's developing in Ukraine right now. And maybe I could elaborate on that a little bit in the Q&A, but I just wanted to make those as kind of introductory comments. I could go on for quite a bit, do a deep dive into Ukrainian Russian history, but I just want to try to hopefully not go into my professor mode too much and try to simplify things without oversimplifying things. One of the things that I think it's essential to, and that's missing from the media coverage of what's going on, is the historical context.
Yeah.
And there is a deep historical context that frames the situation today in Ukraine and Russia, and that has influenced Soviet-Ukrainian relations in so many different ways. And, maybe I'll just go back to sort of the beginnings, as it were. And, that the earliest state formation was actually centered that gave rise to Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania, to a certain degree, Poland as well, was based in Kiev. And it was something called Kiev Rus that was formed in the 860s. And it was the state formation that also converted to Russian Orthodoxy, not to Catholicism, but to Russian Orthodoxy, which is Christian, of course, but rejected the infallibility of the Pope and the authority of the Pope. Pope was just another bishop among many bishops in the Christian world at that time. And one of the things that did is it marked Russian culture, or East Slavic culture, let's say. It differentiated it from points westward, which were Catholic. And so a division between the Catholic and the Orthodox world emerged. And that division cut right through basically present day Ukraine. So one of the things that we can see is that the current struggle in Ukraine is also a reflection of a long-standing kind of division between Eastern and Western Christendom, between Orthodoxy and Catholicism. And it's remarkably durable, that division, in many ways, all the way on up to the present. Another thing that's interesting is that if we look at this first state formation that Russia claims as part of its patrimony, that Ukraine claims as part of its patrimony, Belarus, Lithuania, they all share these same historical roots. And there is some kind of tragic irony, I suppose, in the fact that that in bombing Kiev and attacking Kiev, Putin is actually attacking the sacred sites of Orthodoxy that he claims that he is defending against the Western secular world. So there's some irony in all of that. And he's, I think, aware of that. Okay, so that's what this original state formation. The next kind of important event that shaped the history of Ukraine, that also has shaped this current situation, is in the late 1500s and 1600s. And at that time, Russia was called Muscovy because it was based in Moscow. Kiev Rus had fallen because it was overthrown by and occupied by the Mongols. And so a new Russian state emerged in this place called Moscow in the 1300s and 1400s, and it basically took over where the Mongol power began to recede. And it became a major regional power in Central and Eastern Europe by the beginning of the 1400s and the 1500s. But the most powerful state in Central and Eastern Europe was the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth.
Right, yeah.
And the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which is Catholic, it had many Orthodox subjects, controlled entirely what is today Ukraine, entirely. As Muscovy expanded, it ran into Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, sorry. In many ways, similar to how Russia is running into NATO today in Ukraine and Poland. And so it's sort of this historical kind of clash between West and East on the Eastern Central sort of portions of Europe is nothing new, nothing new. And so in the 1500s, the early 1600s, Poland actually occupied Moscow. and Jesuit priests were running around Moscow trying to convert Orthodox people to Catholicism. They also were engaged in an aggressive attempt, the Polish Catholics, to convert Orthodox subjects in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, including and especially in today what is known as Ukraine. So what happened is that many of the Orthodox subjects of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth who were being forcibly converted to Orthodoxy by the Jesuits and by the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth government went to Moscow and said, defend us from these evil Catholic Poles. And Moscow said, okay, we'll do that. And that triggered the war between Muscovy, the Russian state at that time, and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And Muscovy won. And so in the 1660s, as a result of that, the eastern part of Ukraine, what is today Donetsk, Lugansk, the Donbas region, and extending all the way to Kiev, that eastern part of Ukraine, which was Orthodox under the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, was ceded to Muscovy by the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And so for the first time, what is today Ukrainian territory entered into Russian control. That's in the 1660s and 70s. Now, interestingly, that if you look at Ukraine, that eastern part of Ukraine has always been much more oriented eastward toward Moscow. Mm-hmm. It is Orthodox, not Catholic, and it tends to speak Russian, not Ukrainian.
Okay.
And this is the part of eastern Ukraine that Putin has been trying to control since 2014, effectively sort of supporting paramilitary groups in Donetsk and Lugansk. And the justification for this from Putin's mind is he's thinking historically is that historically this is a Russian place, right? It's Orthodox, it's Russian speaking. At the same time, in the 1660s and 70s, that western part of Ukraine that was Catholic remained under Polish control. So there is this division, right, between, let's say, Orthodox and Catholic Christendom that define the fractures and tensions and conflicts in Eastern Central Europe that endures to this day, by the way, which is really fascinating, right? This is the importance, I think, for me at least, of understanding history. So the next step was under Catherine the Great in the 1770s through the 1780s. Catherine the Great dramatically expanded the Russian Empire by conquering the Ottoman Turks. So Crimea, you've all heard of Crimea. Crimea became part of the Russian Empire under Catherine the Great. And the territory of southern Russia, which of the Southern Russian Empire, which is today part of Ukraine, breadbasket of Europe, as it became known, also entered into Russian control. And Catherine referred to this territory as New Russia, the Russian term Novorossiya, New Russia. Interestingly, if you look at Putin's references to these territories, even before he occupied and amalgamated Crimea, he referred to these areas as New Russia. And he did that quite consciously as a deliberate reference to the New Russia that Catherine the Great had created by acquiring this territory. So, Putin likes to look at maps, historical maps, and to recreate the Russian Empire based on his understanding of its greatest extent in history. And that would have been in the beginning with Catherine the Great up through the 19th century and up through the Soviet period as well. So there's some logic here to what Putin is doing. Putin's thinking historically in a way that is, of course, devastating and tragic for the people who live in these areas that he thinks are part of the patrimony that belong to the Russian state. And it is his duty, his Orthodox duty as he sees it, his duty as a leader of Russia to reestablish empire in all these domains that formerly were under Russian control And to do that in the name of defending the people in those areas against Western Enlightenment, liberal, democratic, secular values. Okay, under Catherine the Great, there was another key moment, and that was when Poland disappeared from the face of the map of Europe as a result of the so-called Polish partitions that began, the first one in the 1770s, and they were complete in the 1780s. And what they resulted in was the obliteration of Poland. So Prussia got a chunk of Poland, and the Habsburg Empire, the Austrian Empire, got another chunk, and Russia got the biggest chunk, actually, the biggest chunk. And that chunk involved even more of what is today Ukraine, added on to that part of Ukraine that it already had acquired. People didn't call it Ukraine then, by the way, with one exception, and that is the westernmost part of what is today Ukraine, which is the capital city of that part of Ukraine is Lviv, or Lvov in Russian, Lviv in Ukrainian. That was under the Habsburg Empire. And it was, let's say, the most Catholic and Western part of Ukraine. And it remained under Habsburg control up through the collapse of the Habsburg Empire in World War I. So traditionally, right, that now we have more of Ukraine as part of the Russian Empire, but we have a chunk of it in the extreme Western portion, which is not under Russian control. And it developed an identity, a sense of itself as anti-Russian, as defending the sort of the leading Eastern edge of Western values and of Catholicism, defending itself against the aggressive imperialist power to the East, and that is to say Russia. So again, what I'm trying to convey here is how this conflict is really conditioned by these historical circumstances and divisions that go way back. Okay, so fast forward to 1917, the collapse of the Soviet Union, collapse of the Russian Empire. And Tsar Nicholas II abdicates, and then the October 1917 Bolshevik Revolution, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. And when the Soviet Union gets formed, it fights a brutal civil war from 1918 to 1921 in order to defend its power. And at great cost, famine and lots of bloodshed, it manages to defend its power. And in 1922, it creates something called the Soviet Union, which is a union of nominally independent national republics that are socialist, but they don't have full sovereignty, right? They're controlled by Moscow. One of them is Ukraine that includes everything except that western part, right? Which is outside of Lviv, which is a part of Poland at that point after World War I. Sorry, I don't want to make this too complex, but okay, so there was a Ukrainian independence movement that emerged when the Tsarist Empire collapsed. And when the Bolsheviks took over in October of 1917 and then fought to defend their power, simultaneously, there was an independent Ukrainian socialist state that was created. And the Bolsheviks were at first aligned with them, but then turned their guns on them and said, you have to be part of the revolutionary system that we're creating. So that nascent sort of Ukrainian nationalist independence that would have been a first independent Ukraine was very short-lived, and then immediately amalgamated into, not immediately, but by 1922 into the Soviet Union. Through the 1920s and 1930s, the Soviet Union and its leaders, particularly Stalin, were of two minds about Ukraine. One was, well, we want to have people that express identities, their own national identities, but we don't want that to lead to them wanting to become independent. So they can have their own poets and so forth, but they need to be socialist and loyal to Moscow and the Communist Party and the revolution. And that always created the suspicion that, the one hand, we have Ukraine, right? But on the other hand, we have we're allowing that to to permit the creation of Ukrainian nationalists that could threaten our control of this territory, which, by the way, is important agriculturally because it has in control of very fertile soils, and also was an important industrial region, particularly in the east with its coal mines and steel industry. So there were periodic campaigns to root out so-called bourgeois nationalists. At the same time that the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic existed with people who were speaking Ukrainian and trying to express their Ukrainian identity. It was a very ambiguous situation. Then something happened that has really is remembered to this day quite profoundly by Ukrainian nationalists, and that is Stalin's policy of collectivization in 1929. 1928-29, up through the early 1930s. Basically what that was is Stalin said, we're going to create a socialist Soviet countryside that's not going to be capitalist. So we're going to herd all the peasants into collective farms, steal their grain to feed the city that we're trying to grow with new industry, and also to sell that grain on international markets in order to finance the purchase of machine tools and technology for our socialist industrialization campaign. And anyone who resists this will be shot or exiled to Siberia. And the focus of collective, the greatest number of deaths, of suffering and starvation as a result of this policy, this brutal policy, occurred where? Ukraine. Ukraine. And this is referred to by Ukrainian nationalists, this period, as genocide. Yep. An attempt at genocide by Moscow, and in particular by Stalin, and that the policy of collectivization, according to them, was directed at the destruction of Ukrainian independence and the Ukrainian nation. And by the way, the estimates vary widely, anywhere from 3 million to 12 to 13 million Ukrainians perished. And it's referred to as the Holodomor, is the Ukrainian term, and that means the great starvation. And in Ukrainian textbooks that emerged after the collapse of the Soviet Union, this episode was often referred to as the equivalent of the Holocaust, as genocide. And the reason I mention this is that this is the context that might help you understand how powerful it is for Zelensky and others in Ukraine to invoke this notion that what Putin is doing is engaging in genocide. Immediately that evokes in the minds of the Ukrainians this horrible episode of starvation as a result of Stalin's policies, brutal policies of collectivization. All these Americans have very short historical memories. History does not, I think, influence our present politics so much because we're kind of divorced from the past in many ways, or at least we don't think of it. But in Eastern Europe, the past is always fresh in people's minds and always framing the present. So that's why I think it's important, at least to do a little bit of a deeper dive into the historical context to understand the passions and animosities that this episode we're observing is generating. Okay, so I've moved on through collectivization. There's another key moment here, and that is World War II. So what happens in World War II, June 22nd, 1941, Operation Barbarossa, the Nazis invade. It looks like the Red Army is going to collapse completely, and the Nazi forces romp through with their blitzkrieg, what is today Ukraine. And they occupy most of Ukraine. And there are many Ukrainians who enthusiastically, I'm not saying the majority, but there are many, particularly in that western part of Ukraine I talked about before, who enthusiastically embrace the Nazi invasion as a way to liberate Ukraine from evil communist control, as they see it. It's something called the Ukrainian Liberation Army, the ULA, and a number of fascist organizations in Ukraine that are anti-Semitic, anti-Russian, anti-Orthodox, very vehemently Catholic, who collaborate with the Nazis. As we all know, Russia defeats, the Soviet Union defeats the Nazis, and then fights a brutal war to regain control over Ukraine. The memory of the collaboration of some Ukrainians with the Nazis infuriates Stalin and many other Russians. And they begin to develop this idea that Ukrainians are disloyal, that there is a kind of element within Ukraine, a right-wing fascist element that is pro-Nazi, that could always potentially reemerge. And this helps us understand, I think, Putin's use of the term denazification with regard to this operation. 28 to 30 million Soviets died during World War II. I mean, it's an astounding number. Most of those, the majority were civilians. So the memory of the destruction, the devastation, the suffering of the war is still so fresh. And this is something that's taught constantly in Russian schools. And central to that is also a tale of all those people who betrayed the Soviet Union and collaborated with the Nazis. That's part of the tale they tell, the tale of suffering and the trauma associated with that invasion. But side by side, the tale of the traitors who were in league with the enemy that caused that suffering. And that's often associated in Russian minds with Ukrainians, particularly Western Ukrainians, Catholic, those in Lviv, that area. Okay, so that's gets us up through World War II. And there were, through the Soviet period, kind of waxing and waning of attempts to suppress Ukrainian nationalism, attacks on so-called bourgeois Ukrainian nationalists, and also attempts to limit the use and teaching of the Ukrainian language. It wasn't thorough and complete, this policy of Russification. It waxed and waned through the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. When the Soviet Union collapsed, like rats leaving a sinking ship, all of the former Communist Party bosses transformed themselves into the George Washingtons of their new nations, and they fed off the carcass of the Soviet Union in order to line their own pockets, and they declared this a revolution and liberation of their nations from communism. The same thing happened in Ukraine. But Ukraine began to construct a tale of woe and suffering. It's typical of all nations, you know, that at the beginning of a nation is a good story about a tale of woe and suffering and persecution. Boston Tea Party, right? In the case of Israel, of course, the Holocaust. And in the case of Ukraine, the Great Starvation, the persecution by the Russians. At the same time, however, Ukrainians were quite aware that the bear is not going to go away, and that you can't antagonize Russia. And Russia made sure that Ukraine had a political system that was subservient to Russian interest and that would not be aligning itself with the West. And that was more or less the situation that existed. Ukraine, like Russia, was a kleptocracy, a place ruled by thieves. Putin presides over a kleptocracy, basically says you can keep your ill-gotten gains the way you looted the carcass of the Soviet Union, so long as you stay out of politics and don't threaten my power. And a similar kind of scenario emerged in Ukraine, and with more or less pro-Russian kleptocrats running the place. And until 2014. 2014, there was a pro-Western movement to overthrow the kleptocrats. And by the way, those who overthrew the kleptocrats, it wasn't clear that they were not kleptocrats as well. But also to orient Ukraine much more toward the West, and in particular toward NATO, and potentially joining the European Union, joining both NATO and the European Union. This horrified Putin. What Putin wants around his periphery, well, I think he wants to reestablish imperial control based on his analysis of all those historical maps I talked about, right? But he also wants on his periphery what he calls managed democracies. What is a managed democracy? It's a place where when you have an election, you know the result before it happens. That's basically what a managed democracy is. It's kind of like what Trump might dream of, managed democracy. And which tells us something about why he likes Putin, perhaps.
Yeah.
And he didn't have that in Ukraine. And what happened in Ukraine, and in response to that, what Putin did is he began to sort of exercise his other emerging plan of reconstructing empire by taking over New Russia, that is to say, that part of Russia that came into the Russian Empire under Catherine the Great, Crimea. And it was a cakewalk. He went in 2014 and virtually no resistance. I've been in Crimea a number of times, not since the occupation, but before, and in 2009. And one of the things I noticed about Crimea is how pro-Russian it was. So I think that was something that inspired Putin to continue trying to carve off more and more slices of pieces of Ukraine, was how easy it was to take Ukraine. And simultaneously, he was trying to undermine the Western, pro-Western elements in the political system that were developing in Ukraine, and to make sure that he could get a managed democracy there. But he could not do that. He got Crimea, but he could not do that. He then began to sponsor attempts by paramilitary organizations to take control over the eastern parts of Ukraine. Those parts of Ukraine historically more Russian oriented, that had come into the Russian Empire in the mid 1600s. And he effectively gained control through paramilitary organizations over the eastern provinces of Donetsk and Lugansk. And all of that was sort of leading up to kind of the present situation. And I guess two things happened. Putin tried to get a pledge of neutrality from Ukraine before all this happened, that Ukraine would not join NATO. He also wanted to get recognition of the annexation of Crimea, and also a de facto recognition that those eastern provinces of Ukraine would no longer be under Ukrainian control. And it appeared to most people that he was going to try to continue to pressure Ukraine in a way that would be primarily diplomatic, right? And undermining democracy from within in the way that perhaps he did in the United, or was rumored to have done in the United States, and also attempt some sort of diplomatic achievement of his goals. But he didn't do that. Instead, he invaded. And I think he invaded because he thought what happened in Crimea would happen in the eastern parts of Ukraine all the way to Kiev. And this was a tremendous blunder for someone who comes out of the KGB and the secret police. This was a massive intelligence failure. And, you know, historians are going to have to figure out why he did this. Is he drinking the Kool-Aid of his own propaganda? Is it increasing isolation after 2 years of COVID? You know, one of the things is that has been clear in Russia in the buildup to the invasion is that Putin has basically abandoned interacting with his foreign ministry, the diplomatic corps, and that he relies increasingly on a very small group of people in the security services, the successor to the KGB, the FSB, and also the military. And it's this group of maybe 4 or 5 people that actually are in control of the decision to invade. And the entire foreign ministry and many of the high-level state officials that were actually taken aback and surprised by the invasion, not even informed of it. It would be sort of like, I guess, you know, what would happen if the NSC would take over all American foreign policy and completely exclude the State Department and the diplomatic corps from having any role in foreign policy. It's kind of what has happened in Russia under Putin in these last couple of years. And a very small number of people in the security organs have orchestrated this under the false assumption that it would be a cakewalk, just like it was in Crimea. But it wasn't. And so here we are. So I just I'll open up for questions.
That was great. I keep thinking of Kennedy with the Bay of Pigs, where he thought, you know, the Cubans were going to rise up. Okay, so I want to try to get through everybody's question. I was going to go by alphabetical order. So Erwin, you'd be next. We'll by first name. So Alan, you're on, and we have about I'd say 15 minutes to get through everybody's questions. So thank you. That was great. Go ahead, Alan.
Hey, well, I guess first thing it'd be like maybe a comment here is when you're talking about freshmen. Thank you for being here, by the way.
Oh.
Thank you for your talk. When you were talking about Putin wanting to reclaim the ancient Russian Empire, it seemed to me like it's the same kind of thinking of ISIS trying to recreate the caliphate in the Middle East. Good luck. But I guess my question is, to me, it seems like Russia now is making the same types of mistakes the United States made in post-World War II era, trying to push its power all over the world and control things all over the world, and getting its military involved where it's not necessarily a good thing. And you look at it like I look at what Putin intervened in Syria. And you could say that he was on the winning side, but what did he win? It seems to me that Sadat now is the emperor of the North Pole, and all they really did is open up the country for Iranian influence. So I just wonder if you think that he is doing the same types of things the United States did, perhaps for different reasons, or definitely for different reasons, I would hope. But it seems to me it's the same type of mistakes he's making now that we have been making all along.
Yeah, I would agree with you completely. I would say it's much worse. And the reason I would say it's much worse is because Russia is a far poorer nation with far fewer resources. It's resource rich in a sense, but its population is shrinking. It doesn't have a sort of the post-industrial economy that it needs, Silicon Valley, that kind of thing to generate income. It has oil, lots of oil, right? But lots of gas, that's its calling card. But so here's what I would say is that this is a classic example of hubris. What happens when you have too few resources and too great an ambition, and you set yourself up for tragic downfall. And I agree with you. I think the United States suffered from this kind of ambitions that were out of step with available resources. And when you reach that position, right, you have to, if you're thinking rationally, you have to scale back your ambitions to accord with your available resources. But here's the problem with Putin's ideology is that it constructs, it's called Eurasianism, is this ideology that he has. It's replaced communism, basically. And that is, it envisions Russia as a great imperial power. So it sets up, his ideology demands outsized ambitions that do not fit with the available resources to realize them. And I think that's illustrated so dramatically by the failure of the Russian military in Ukraine. Right? That its ambitions are out of accord with its available resources, and all those tanks blowing up, right? And all the tens of thousands of reported Russian casualties are an illustration of how those ambitions have gotten way out of step with available resources. And of course, yeah, the outcome, this is a Greek, in a Greek tragedy, hubris is what brings down the hero.
That's right.
And in some way there's going to be a comeuppance, though. Stalin was, Stalin in a way was much shrewder, right? He knew when to scale back his ambitions, and Putin does. I don't think he does. And this is something that's taken a lot of people by surprise, to make them think that something switched in Putin's head, because he wasn't always like this, right? It seems like that something's going on with him. And I don't want to do armchair psychology and all that kind of stuff, but it's hard to see how this can work out well for Putin.
Right. Yeah. I wanted to bring Erwin in, who I think wants to have a slightly different line of questioning. Go ahead, Erwin.
Couple of things. Number one, the whole business with Chechnya really bothers me, because there he had to create a different boogeyman. And the boogeyman there was another Islamic state in his community. And there's reports that that Putin got the idea, he was just in power less than a year, that he was going to destroy Chechnya and show how powerful he was. And he did that. And as an excuse, he used the bombing of some apartment buildings.
Right, yeah.
And there was suspicion that the FSB was behind those bombings.
Right.
Now, you know more about history than I do, but I heard about that. And I'm just wondering whether you could clarify some of that.
Yeah, well, I was in Moscow when that happened.
Oh my God.
So I remember that quite well. And so Putin, that was what thrust Putin into power. And this is part of his playbook, right? But I think that this playbook worked until it didn't work anymore. What's the playbook? Okay, I can kill two birds with one stone, right? I can consolidate control over territory by engaging in these very vicious attacks on people that are supposedly a threat to the integrity of the Russian state. And so Chechens were configured as a threat to the Russian state by, and the illustration of that were these bombings of apartment buildings that killed many hundreds of civilians, innocent people. And I think there's a lot of, it's hard to say for sure, but I think it's likely that Putin and the FSB had something to do in creating this as a pretext, right, for justifying the vicious invasion of Chechnya, where Putin famously said, I'm going to wipe them out in the toilet, using Russian mobster language. And what happened as a result of this? Putin immediately used the national security emergency to consolidate his power, to rein in the peripheries. For instance, he eliminated the election of governors in the provinces, the states outside of in Russia, and they were to now be appointed under the pretext of needing to do this for national security reasons. And he has used wars, the Georgian War in 2008, the annexation of Crimea. Every time he's done that, he has also consolidated his power at home. And so what we're seeing now is part of that playbook, using a national security emergency and the threat of some sort of foreign threat to the integrity of the Russian state as a pretext for expanding territorial control, while at the same time solidifying his own power at home. But the playbook worked until it hasn't. Well, you know, the jury's still out.
I wanted to, that's great. Thank you. Joel, do you want to ask a question? Then we'll get to Marcia.
I was wondering, can you imagine a way for Putin to be able to save face and leave in any way?
Well, yeah, here's where I think I would, you know, maybe contradict a little bit what I've just said. And that is that, I started by saying we'll probably be surprised by the outcome. And maybe one of the surprising outcomes that we'll be surprised by is that Putin will survive and manage to consolidate his power. And there's some polling, it's always suspect in the context of an autocratic system, but there's some polling that suggests overwhelming support for Putin's policies within Russia. So he seems to have a lot of domestic support. And I know this anecdotally from many Russian contacts who have gone from anti-Putin to pro-Putin in the last 2-3 weeks.
Really?
That's
Really?
so that's something we need to consider, right? We shouldn't assume that they're champing at the bit in Russia to get rid of Putin.
Do they have access to information about what's really going on?
Yeah, right. We're waiting for the mothers with the bodies.
Well, that's a good question, right? And there are a certain segment of more sort of middle class, emerging middle class, more sophisticated sort of Russians that have had access to alternative sources of information, but they've been systematically shut down in the last 2 months. And also firewalls have gone up. You can get through those firewalls, right? But it's more and more difficult to get access to alternative modes of representation of what's going on. So that's one point I would make. The other point I would make is that those that are opposed to Putin are getting out in droves. We're having a mass emigration, just as we did in the 1920s and 30s and under Stalin. The people are getting out. That is to say, the people that think more like us, let's say, on this issue are leaving behind those that are behind Putin, which is, working in Putin's favor. And that's one of the goals maybe that he's been seeking here. And now Putin is the ultimate cynic. he is a secret police person. Secret police people anywhere are the most cynical people you can imagine. They're purely transactional, and they're willing to sacrifice people to achieve their goals. They don't care about that, right? And so Putin he's not flinching, which is really kind of curious, right? And so there's a possibility he gets a negotiated settlement in Ukraine. Let's say Crimea is recognized as part of Russia, maybe some sort of, those eastern provinces are carved off in some way, and then Ukrainian neutrality is guaranteed. Putin survives, his power consolidated at home, and then he separates Russia from Western contamination as he sees it, and can declare that he's achieved all of his goals. Denazification of Ukraine, separation of Russia from the contaminating influences of Western democratic values, making sure that they have no transgender toilets in Russia, that kind of thing. Which, by the way, that sounds maybe ridiculous, but that actually is a big issue for Putin, and homophobia and transphobia play well in Putin's politics. That represent, right, transgender toilets, everything that threatens Russian civilization. I say that half jokingly, but
we're seeing that here too. So it's not that. Marcia, I think we just have time for one more question. I wanted to make sure we got you in. I think you're muted. There you go. Oops, you're still muted. Okay.
Yeah, thank you. I was surprised that Putin thought he could manage this, given the demonstrations in 2014, where people obviously wanted to turn west and turn west and turn west. They got rid of Yanukovych. He fled. Their government fell. They had elections, as though Putin didn't notice that. So I'm wondering if this would ever end. That it will never. I don't think. Do you think he can ever really win? And is it time to look at the negotiations, whatever they are, to meet Zelensky's demands? Because we're looking at what can Zelensky concede, and I think it's time to think about what Russia can do to get out of there, save what's left of their self-esteem, and call this operation over.
Yeah, no, I see where you're coming from. I just don't know that Putin sees the damages and the sacrifices and the failures to this point as something that's going to prevent him from continuing. In fact, they may actually embolden him even more to continue the fight and to move to Eastern Ukraine, right? And then make sure that Ukraine will not be an unmanaged democracy as he sees it, and that Russia will decapitate that part of Ukraine that wants to look westward, and then gain control over some of its territory. And he may very well succeed in doing that. And long term, I mean, the reality is that Russia is going to have a sphere of influence on its borders, whether we like it or not. And I guess the question for the West is, how much are we willing to risk World War III for the sake of Ukraine? And Putin is calculating this as well. And, we all sympathize. And by the way, I think it would be a mistake to characterize Zelensky as sort of unambiguously as a freedom fighter and Democrat. I mean, he's clearly a better guy than Putin, right? But I think the representations of him are a little bit out of control at this point, in terms of, evil Putin, freedom fighter, freedom-loving Zelensky. It's more complex than that. And Zelensky, by the way, is hemmed in by his right wing. Those right-wing Ukrainian nationalists are now saying, and I've seen more and more public proclamations coming out of some of those politicians in Western Ukraine from Lviv and elsewhere, saying not one compromise can be made with Putin. We will not give up any territory. We will join NATO. We will join the EU. And Zelensky is facing those forces. And they've actually, there are some that have threatened that if he compromises with Putin, they will kill him.
Oh, yeah, I think we have to end it there. That's, God, I was hoping for a tidier ending, but this just leaves us with more questions and kind of a horizon of horror or a long war of attrition.
Yeah.
But let me, and thank you so much, Professor Jenks. Concerned Citizens wants to thank our guest for sharing his insights with us. He has increased our understanding of the current Russian situation, including really valuable historical information too. And Concerned Citizens thanks you, our audience, for taking the time to watch this program. Thank you again, and we'll see you soon. Thanks.